They built a task force around one man, assigned careers to his shadow, filled filing cabinets with his name, and after 20 years he walked past them every morning. Harlem, early 1940s. The war was happening somewhere else. Over there, in Europe, in the Pacific, in the telegrams that arrived, folded, and official at apartment doors on Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue and Street Nicholas Place. Over there, boys from Harlem were dying in segregated units for a country that wouldn't let them eat at the same lunch counter as the men they were dying beside. But here, on 116th Street, the war had a different shape. It had no trenches, no uniforms you could see. It had cigarette smoke drifting out of second-floor windows at 2 in the morning. It had numbers slips folded into palms between handshakes. It had an economy that the federal government had never figured out how to tax because it had never figured out how to see it. The FBI arrived in Harlem the way most outsiders arrived in Harlem, certain they understood it. 1943. J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Investigation had been watching Harlem for years, not closely, not yet the way you watch a neighborhood from a moving car. You see the surface. You see what's meant to be seen, the storefronts, the churches, the barber shops, the men standing on corners not because they have nowhere to go, but because the corner is where business happens. The Bureau's first serious Harlem field office was not called a field office. It was called a Community Observation Unit. The language was deliberate. Hoover understood optics. He understood that sending federal agents openly into a black neighborhood in 1943, during a war his government was fighting partly in the name of freedom, required a certain careful naming. So they did not investigate. They observed. They rented 2 rooms, one above a dry cleaner on 115th. One at the back of a building on 8th Avenue that smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood. They paid their rent in cash. They introduced themselves as insurance adjusters. Nobody believed them. Nobody said so. The first agent assigned to what would become the Bumpy Johnson surveillance file was a man named Gerald Fitch, 31 years old, Baltimore-born, Yale-educated. He had worked organized crime cases in Chicago and Philadelphia, and believed, with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in a city he understood, that criminal networks followed predictable patterns. Money up, orders down. Fear as the binding agent. He had read the early Harlem files, the names, the numbers, the suspected revenue streams. He had seen the name Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson appear 47 times across 12 separate reports, always in relation to something, never as the direct subject of a proven crime. Fitch requested the Harlem assignment himself. He told his supervisor it would take 8 months, 14 at the outside. He would stay 4 years and leave with nothing that would hold in a courtroom. But we are not at his departure yet. We are at his arrival. September 1943. A Tuesday morning. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the block smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Fitch walked 116th Street for the first time at 9:15 a.m. He wore a brown suit that was too good for the neighborhood and shoes that were too clean for the sidewalk, and everyone who saw him knew immediately what he was. Not because federal agents had a particular look, though they did, but because Harlem had been watching people watch it for long enough that it had developed a sense, a peripheral awareness, the way you learn to feel a draft before you find the open window. Nobody ran, nobody scattered, nobody did anything at all. That was the first thing Fitch noted in his initial field report. Subject community displays no visible reaction to federal presence. Possible indicator of sophisticated counter-surveillance awareness. He was right about the sophistication, wrong about what it meant. It didn't mean they were afraid of being caught. It meant they had already decided not to give him anything to catch. 3 weeks into the assignment, Fitch's unit had established reliable visual surveillance on 6 locations they believed to be connected to Johnson's operation. They had recruited 2 informants, both of whom provided accurate, detailed, and entirely useless information about things that had already happened and people who had already moved. They had also taken 43 photographs. The 40th photograph, the one that would be referenced in Bureau internal memos for the next 2 decades, passed from one assigned agent to the next, like a strange inheritance, showed Bumpy Johnson standing on the corner of 116th and 8th Avenue at 7:40 on a Wednesday morning. He was feeding pigeon, a paper bag in his left hand, his right hand extended, flat, palm up, 3 pigeons on his arm, 1 on his shoulder. He was not looking at the camera. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was wearing a dark coat, no hat, and the expression on his face was the same expression you'd see on any man doing a thing he had done 1,000 times before and expected to do 1,000 times again. Nothing illegal, nothing threatening, nothing that suggested the 47 prior references to his name in 12 federal reports. Fitch wrote in his log that evening, subject observed in routine activity. No contact made with known associates. No exchange of materials. No indication of criminal conduct. Then, beneath that, in handwriting slightly different from the official notation looser, like a man thinking out loud, he knew we were there. That was the architecture of the problem, though it would take the Bureau years to name it clearly. They were looking for evidence of a criminal enterprise. What they kept finding instead was a neighborhood. And a neighborhood, a real one built on 30 years of migration and music and mutual survival and a particular kind of self-governing pride, did not behave like a criminal enterprise. It did not have org charts. It did not have written contracts. It did not have the paper structures that federal law in 1943 needed in order to build a case. It had something older than paper. It had memory, obligation, the kind of loyalty that isn't transactional because it was never purchased. Harlem did not protect Bumpy Johnson because it feared him. That was the second thing Gerald Fitch got wrong. And it was the more important mistake. He would spend 4 years trying to find the fear, trying to locate the coercion, the threat, the leverage that he believed must be underneath every act of community silence, because that was how it worked everywhere else he'd been. In Chicago, in Philadelphia, in every organized crime network the Bureau had successfully prosecuted, the silence of witnesses was a product of violence or the credible threat of it. You found the fear, and you offered protection from it, and eventually someone talked. Nobody talked, not because no one was afraid. People in Harlem in 1943 had plenty to be afraid of. Poverty, eviction, police, the draft board, the weight of a country that asked for your labor and your sons and offered very little in return. But they were not afraid of Bumpy Johnson. And that was a distinction the Bureau's entire operational model had no category for. The pigeon photograph was still in the file when the next agent took over. And the one after that, and the one after that. Nobody threw it away. Nobody logged it as irrelevant. It stayed, year after year, passed forward through administrations and reorganizations and war and peace and the slow turning of decades. A man feeding birds on a Tuesday morning, the beginning of 20 years of failure. Nobody understood yet, not Fitch, not the Bureau, not even the men watching from the doorways of buildings. They'd lived in their whole lives that the photograph was not a document of a quiet moment between criminal activities. It was a document of how Bumpy Johnson operated every single day, quietly, openly, in plain sight, daring the Bureau to explain what law a man breaks by feeding pigeons on his own block. They never could. 6 blocks south, in a building on 110th Street, a different kind of file was being built. But that is the next part of the story. Harlem, 1943. The same streets, a different pair of eyes. Ask the Bureau what Bumpy Johnson was, and they would hand you a file. Ask Harlem, and the room would go quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a question is too simple for the answer it deserves. The kind of quiet that means, where do you want me to start? Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, on the 31st of October 1905, Halloween. People noted that later The way people always find meaning in the details of a man's birth once they know what he became. But in 1905, in Charleston, there was nothing prophetic about the date. There was only a mother, a child, and a city that had already decided what kind of future a black boy born in the South could expect. He came to Harlem the way most of his generation came, by necessity first, by choice second, and eventually by something that felt, if not like belonging, then like the closest thing to it he had ever been offered. He was a teenager when he arrived. The city was loud and fast and full of men who had come from the same places he had, carrying the same freight of history, and had decided collectively, defiantly, to build something here that had never existed in the places they'd left. By the time the Bureau opened its first serious file on him, Bumpy Johnson was 38 years old. He had already survived things that would have ended most men. He had survived the street education of 1920s Harlem, which was not metaphorical. It was specific and physical, and it taught lessons that no university had a course for. He had survived the Dutch Schultz years, the early 1930s, when a white gangster from the Bronx decided that Harlem's numbers racket was too profitable to remain in black hands and moved to take it. Most men in Bumpy's position either bent or disappeared. Bumpy did neither. He fought, not recklessly, strategically, with a patience that men twice his age recognized as something rare. He had survived 2 stretches in prison before Alcatraz. He had survived a city that did not survive many men like him. And now, in 1943, he was walking 116th Street every morning like a man who owned the weather. The grocer's name was Arthur Reeves. He had operated the same store on 117th Street for 19 years. When Bumpy Johnson walked in on a Thursday afternoon in October 1943, the same week, Fitch's unit was finalizing its first surveillance report. Reeves did something that the agent watching from across the street noted but could not explain. He put away the price list. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He simply reached under the counter, removed the handwritten sheet of paper listing that week's prices, folded it twice, and set it beneath the register. The agent's log entry read, "Unknown significance. Possible prearranged signal." It wasn't a signal. It was simpler than that, and more complicated. Arthur Reeves had come to Harlem from Georgia in 1921. He had opened his store in 1924 with money borrowed from 3 different people, all of whom he had paid back within 2 years. He was a careful man, a fair man, a man who understood the difference between surviving in a neighborhood and being part of one. He put the price list away because Bumpy Johnson did not pay retail. Not because Bumpy demanded a discount. He had never once asked for one. But because one winter, 1938, the February that the heating oil ran short and 3 families on the block nearly froze, Bumpy Johnson had walked into Reeves' store and bought every blanket on the shelf, paid full price, asked for nothing in return, left them at the building on the corner with no note, no name attached, no expectation of acknowledgement. Reeves found out 2 weeks later, the way you find out things in Harlem, through the slow circulation of a story that starts at one end of the block and arrives, slightly changed, slightly warmer, at the other end. He had put the price list away ever since, not out of fear, out of something that doesn't have a clean legal category. The Bureau had no form for it. The Bureau's file described Bumpy Johnson as primary controller of Harlem numbers operations, suspected ties to organized crime structures, believed to use intimidation and violence to maintain territorial dominance. Every word in that description was, in some narrow technical sense, connected to something real, and every word missed the point entirely, because the file was built on a model, a template, a theory of how men like Bumpy Johnson operated that had been developed by studying men who were not Bumpy Johnson, men in Chicago, men in Philadelphia, men who ran operations built on fear as a primary currency, who maintained control through violence and the threat of it, who were always one defection away from collapse because their entire structure depended on people being more afraid of them than of anything else. That model worked in those cities. It had produced convictions. It had built the Bureau's organized crime playbook chapter by chapter. It did not work in Harlem. Not for this man. Because the foundation was wrong. There was a moment, late November, 1943, a Friday evening, the block already dark by 5 o'clock, that the surveillance agent on duty, a young man named Carver, who had been on the Harlem assignment for 3 weeks, witnessed and recorded in his log. A woman was arguing with a landlord on the stoop of a building on 116th Street. The landlord, a man named Polanski, who owned 4 buildings on the block and was known for his creative interpretation of lease agreements, was attempting to collect a rent increase that had not been in any signed document. The woman was alone. She was maybe 50 years old. She had a grocery bag in one hand and she was not backing down, but she was not winning either. Polanski was louder, and he had the deed to the building, and in 1943 those two things together tended to end arguments. Bumpy Johnson came around the corner at 5:22 p.m. He did not raise his voice. Agent Carver was close enough to observe the interaction, but not close enough to hear it clearly. What he recorded was this. Subject Johnson approached the dispute. Exchanged words with building owner, duration approximately 90 seconds. Building owner departed the scene. Woman entered the building. Subject Johnson continued walking. No physical contact observed. No apparent threat made. What Agent Carver could not record, because he could not hear it, and because it would not have fit into any category on his reporting form, was what Polanski told his wife that evening when he came home. He told her he had looked at Bumpy Johnson for those 90 seconds and realized, not for the first time but more clearly than ever before, that there were 2 kinds of power in the world, the kind that needed to announce itself, and the kind that didn't. He said Bumpy Johnson had never once raised his voice at him. In years of doing business in that neighborhood, not once. And that was, somehow, the part that made it impossible to argue. This was the man the Bureau was trying to build a case against. Not a tyrant, not a thug, not the cartoon figure their file described. A man who understood that in Harlem, in 1943, real power did not look like the power you read about in newspapers or federal reports. Real power looked like a woman getting to keep her apartment at the price she signed for. Real power looked like heating oil in February. Real power looked like a price list being folded and put under a register without a word being exchanged. The Bureau kept looking for violence. They kept finding something they had no word for. Across the street, in a building he had never entered, in files he had never read, Bumpy Johnson was described in 47 separate entries. None of them came close. You cannot put a man in a file if you don't understand what holds him together. And nobody at the Bureau, not Fitch, not Carver, not the supervisors in Washington, who read the quarterly reports and stamped them with their thick black active designation, understood what held Bumpy Johnson together. It wasn't violence. It wasn't fear. It was something the Bureau had never surveilled, never photographed, never reduced to a line in a quarterly report. It was the fact that on 116th Street, in the cold of November 1943, people simply did not want to live in a world where Bumpy Johnson was gone. That is not a fact you can prosecute. 3 blocks north, Gerald Fitch was typing his weekly summary. He had a new informant. He was cautiously optimistic. He was wrong to be. Washington, D.C., January 1944. The Hoover Building. The memo arrived on a Thursday, not delivered dramatically, not handed across a desk with the weight of consequence. It came in a manila envelope with a routing stamp on the upper left corner and a classification mark that meant, in practical terms, important enough to read, not important enough to act on immediately. J. Edgar Hoover read it on a Friday morning between 2 other memos. He made one notation in the margin. 3 words, in his distinctive compressed handwriting, build the case. By Monday, Gerald Fitch had his authorization. February 1944. The Harlem surveillance operation enters its second phase. The first phase had been observation, patient, methodical, deliberately, slow. The kind of groundwork that experienced federal investigators understood was not optional. You watched before you moved, because moving too early was worse than not moving at all. A case that collapsed in court did not just lose it warned. It told the subject exactly what you had, exactly how you'd gathered it, and exactly where your operation had limits. Fitch understood this. He was careful, but careful had a deadline. Hoover's office did not allocate resources indefinitely to observation without product. Build the case was not a suggestion. It was a clock starting. Fitch had 6 months. He believed that was more than enough. The infrastructure he assembled in those first weeks of 1,944 was, by Bureau standards of the era, substantial. 4 agents in rotating field positions, 2 paid informants, both Harlem residents, both men who had their own complicated reasons for cooperating with federal investigators, reasons that had less to do with Bumpy Johnson specifically, and more to do with debts, pressures, and the particular arithmetic of men who have run out of other options. 3 wiretaps, 1 on a phone line connected to a social club on 116th Street that Bureau intelligence believed was used for operational communications, 1 on the private line of a man named Curtis Webb, identified in prior reports as a trusted associate of Johnson, 1 on a line that, it would later emerge, was connected to a dry cleaning business that had no relationship to Bumpy Johnson whatsoever, and was operated by a retired schoolteacher from Savannah who spent most of her phone calls discussing her sister's arthritis. That particular wiretap produced 46 recorded conversations over 3 months. None of them were useful. The schoolteacher's name was never entered into the official file. March 1944. The case begins to take shape, or appears to. The informant they trusted most was a man Fitch identified in his reports only as Source 7. His real name was not recorded in the documents that survived either by design or by the particular casualness with which the Bureau sometimes treated the identities of black informants in that era, a casualness that itself said something about whose safety was considered worth protecting. Source 7 was 34 years old. He had grown up 4 blocks from 116th Street. He knew the neighborhood the way you know a language you learned, before you knew you were learning it, not as a system of rules, but as a living thing, felt more than analyzed. He had come to the Bureau not because he wanted to destroy Bumpy Johnson. Fitch's early reports suggest he initially understood Source 7's motivation as financial, a man in debt, a man who needed federal protection from something unrelated to Johnson. The specific nature of that something was never clarified in the surviving documents. What is clear is this: Source 7 knew things, real things, specific things, names, dates, locations, the particular rhythms of how money moved through Harlem's informal economy. He was not fabricating. He was not performing the kind of vague cooperation that informants sometimes offered enough detail to seem credible, not enough to be actionable. He gave Fitch the architecture of an operation. For 3 weeks, in March 1944, Gerald Fitch believed he was 6 weeks away from the most significant organized crime prosecution in Bureau history. He wrote to his supervisor, "The case is solid. The structure is visible. We are ready to move toward a grand jury presentation within the quarter." His supervisor forwarded the memo to Hoover's office. Hoover made no notation this time. He waited. The case collapsed on a Wednesday, not dramatically, not with a single fatal discovery. It came apart the way things come apart in Harlem when the Bureau overreaches slowly, then all at once, like a knot that holds under pressure and then releases every thread simultaneously the moment the tension shifts. Source 7 stopped returning contact. Not dramatically, no confrontation, no explicit refusal. He simply became unavailable. The dead drop location on 118th Street went unused for 5 days. Then 10. When Fitch finally made direct contact, through a secondary channel. Source 7 was polite, calm, and entirely without information. He said he didn't know anything anymore. Fitch pressed. Source 7 repeated himself. I don't know anything anymore. The second informant, a man identified as Source 3 in the files, a numbers runner who had been providing route information for 2 months, recanted every statement he had made, in writing, through a lawyer Fitch had never seen before, and whose retainer he could not account for. The wiretap on Curtis Webb's line produced nothing in March that it had not produced in January. Conversations about weather, about family, about baseball, nothing that connected to anything in the case file. And then the social club on 116th Street went quiet, not closed open every day, lights on, men coming and going, but the phone line produced nothing operational. Not because the calls had stopped, because, Fitch would eventually conclude, they had simply moved to a different line, in a different location. 3 days before the Bureau's most intensive surveillance window, the question Fitch asked himself, and could not answer, was how. How had they known? Not that he was building a case that much could have been inferred from the increased federal presence, but the timing, the precision. Source 7, going cold on the exact week that the grand jury preparation was supposed to begin. The phone line going quiet 3 days before the surveillance intensified. He reviewed his operation for leaks. Standard procedure. He found none that he could confirm. He reviewed Source 7's background again, looked for connections to Johnson that might explain the sudden silence. Found connections everywhere, because in Harlem, in 1944, everyone had connections to Bumpy Johnson, the way everyone in a small town has a connection to the person who has lived there the longest and done the most. He could not find the specific breach. He never would, because the breach was not a person. It was not a leak in the conventional sense, an agent who talked, a document that moved, a communication that was intercepted. The breach was the neighborhood itself. This requires understanding something about how Harlem functioned in 1944 that no Bureau field manual contained. Information in Harlem did not travel the way it traveled in the cities where the Bureau had built its methodology. It did not travel through organizational channels, from superior to subordinate, along the lines of hierarchy that federal investigators were trained to map and monitor. It traveled the way weather traveled. A federal agent asking too many questions in the wrong barbershop on a Tuesday morning became, by Thursday afternoon, a general awareness that the temperature had changed. Nobody held a meeting. Nobody sent a memo. The information moved through the same channels that had been moving information through that community for 30 years, through the small transactions of daily life, through the almost imperceptible shifts in how people held themselves when they passed certain corners, through the economy of glances between people who had known each other long enough to communicate without words. Source 7 did not receive a phone call telling him to stop. He woke up one morning and understood that the temperature had changed. And he made a decision not because he was threatened, not because he was paid, not because he feared Bumpy Johnson, but because he lived on those streets, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who has to look his neighbors in the face every morning for the rest of his life, that there are things you do not do, not because of consequences, because of who you are. Fitch filed his final report on the first case attempt in April 1944, 3 pages, single-spaced. The language was professional, measured, careful in the way that men write when they are trying to explain a failure without calling it a failure. The final paragraph read, "Recommend continued surveillance and development of new informant relationships. Current case infrastructure insufficient for prosecution. Suggest reassessment of operational approach before next attempt." His supervisor read it and wrote one word in the margin. Agreed. In Washington, the file was stamped, not closed, active. Fitch sat at his desk on a Friday afternoon in April 1944 and looked at 43 photographs, 2 recanted statements, 3 wiretap transcripts full of weather reports and baseball scores, and 1 image of a man feeding pigeons on a Wednesday morning. He looked at them for a long time. Then, he put them back in the folder. Outside, on 116th Street, it was raining. Bumpy Johnson was probably somewhere dry. The next attempt would take 2 more years to build, and it would end the same way. For reasons that were beginning, slowly, to become clear, though Fitch would leave the assignment before he understood them fully. Harlem, 1945. The war is ending somewhere else again. The boys were coming home. Not all of them. Some came home in the folded telegrams that had been arriving on Lenox Avenue for 3 years. Some came home, changed in ways that didn't have names, yet sitting too still in rooms that were too small, flinching at sounds that nobody else heard, carrying something across the ocean that the ocean hadn't taken back. But some came home whole, or close enough to whole that Harlem decided to call it whole. And Harlem received them, the way Harlem received everything, with noise and food and music, and the particular fierce tenderness of a community that had learned, over generations, that joy was not something you waited for permission to feel. On 116th Street, the mood in the late summer of 1945 was something close to celebration. Bumpy Johnson watched it from the window of a second-floor room above a restaurant on 8th Avenue. He watched the street below the returning soldiers, the women who had worked the factories, the children who had grown 2 years older while their fathers were away, and he watched, with the expression of a man who has learned to separate what a moment looks like from what a moment means. He was 40 years old. He had been running Harlem's numbers operation, in various configurations and under various pressures, for the better part of a decade. He had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived the Italian mob's repeated attempts to absorb what he had built. He had survived 2 federal attempts to prosecute him and one that never made it as far as a file. He had survived by being invisible in plain sight. And in 1945, with the war ending and the Bureau's attention momentarily divided, and a new generation of Harlem men coming home with military training and a particular shortage of patience for being told what they could and couldn't do, Bumpy Johnson made a decision. He would explain it to no one. He never did. To understand what the FBI could not find, you have to understand what they were looking for. The Bureau's organized crime model in the 1940s was built on a specific architecture. It assumed that criminal enterprises operated like corporations hierarchically, with clear lines of authority, documented transactions, and a paper trail that, with enough time and resources, could be located, seized, and presented to a grand jury. This model worked. It had worked against the Italian-American syndicates in New York and Chicago. It had worked against bootlegging operations during Prohibition. It had worked in city after city, against organization after organization, because those organizations, whatever their violence, whatever their reach, ultimately operated within a recognizable structure. They had bosses and underbosses. They had territories defined in agreements that, however informal, left evidence. They had money that moved through banks and front businesses and left the kind of traces that a forensic accountant could follow. The Bureau looked at Harlem's numbers operation and assumed the same structure existed. They were looking for the wrong building entirely. The numbers racket in Harlem in the 1940s was not, first and foremost, a criminal enterprise. That is not a moral argument. It is a structural one. It was a community financial system. In a neighborhood where black residents were systematically excluded from mainstream banking, where redlining and discriminatory lending practices had made conventional financial institutions not just inaccessible but actively hostile, the numbers provided something that no federal program and no legitimate bank was offering: liquidity, credit, a daily economic participation that made people feel, however modestly, like they had a stake in something. A numbers bet was a penny, a nickel, a dime. The potential return was 600 to 1. Those odds were worse than they appeared. The house kept enough to operate, and the house was Bumpy Johnson's organization, but the point was never purely mathematical. The point was the daily ritual, The slip of paper passed between familiar hands. The sense of possibility that arrived every morning with the publication of the winning number derived from the mutual totals at a racetrack in a city that most of Harlem's residents would never visit. It was the one financial instrument available to people who had been systematically excluded from every other one. Bumpy Johnson did not invent this system. It had existed in Harlem before him, but he had inherited it, defended it, and in the way that the best administrators of any system do, made it work better than it had before, more reliably, more fairly, with less violence than it had operated under when outside interests tried to control it. This was the thing the Bureau's file could not capture, because the Bureau's file was looking for a criminal enterprise preying on a community. What was actually there was something more complicated, a community economy with a man at its center who understood that his survival and the community's survival were not separate questions. So how did it work? How did an operation of that scale move money, resolve disputes, and maintain order without contracts, without written records, without the organizational infrastructure that every federal investigator was trained to find? The answer was not a secret. It was hiding in the most obvious place. It was hiding in the way Harlem worked every single day. The first layer was geography. 116th Street was not just an address, it was a communication system. The barbershops, the restaurants, the social clubs, the churches, every institution on that strip functioned as a node in a network that passed information with a speed and accuracy that no telephone exchange could match. Not coded information, not encrypted messages, just the ordinary currency of daily life, who was where, what had happened, what the temperature was. The people who worked in those establishments had known each other for decades. They had grown up together, married each other's cousins, attended the same churches, buried the same friend. They did not need to be instructed to share what they knew. They did not need to be paid to do it. They simply lived there. And living there meant knowing things, and knowing things meant, when the moment required it, acting on what you knew without being asked. An agent walking the block for the first time saw storefronts and foot traffic and the ordinary texture of urban life. What was actually happening was a distributed intelligence network with 30 years of institutional memory and zero paper documentation. The second layer was trust, but not the word, as the Bureau understood it. In the Bureau's vocabulary, trust was a vulnerability, the thing you exploited in informants, the thing you undermined in criminal organizations to produce defections and testimony. In Harlem, trust was the infrastructure itself. It was not naive. Nobody on 116th Street in 1945 was operating on innocent faith in human nature. These were people who had survived the Great Migration, the Depression, 2 world wars, and a domestic policy that had treated their lives as negotiable. They understood betrayal. They understood the cost of misplaced confidence. What they had built over decades, across generations, was something more durable than naive trust. It was earned trust, tested trust, the kind that comes from watching how someone behaves, not in the good moments, but in the bad ones. And Bumpy Johnson had been tested. In 1935, during the Harlem riots, the explosion of rage that swept through the neighborhood after the rumored beating of a Puerto Rican teenager in a department store on 125th Street, Bumpy Johnson had walked the streets alone. No bodyguards, no weapon visible. He had walked from block to block, talking to people, standing between groups that were seconds from tipping into violence, absorbing the heat of the moment without reflecting it back. He did not give speeches. He did not claim authority he hadn't earned. He was simply present, calm, unafraid, in the middle of something that was breaking apart, behaving like a man who believed it could hold. It held. The agents, who had been surveilling him, filed a report on it afterward. The report described his behavior as subject's possible attempt to protect operational interests during civil disturbance. The people who had been on those streets that night described it differently. They said, "He was there. That was enough. The third layer was the deliberate absence of paper. This was not accidental, and it was not primitive. It was a sophisticated operational decision that Bumpy Johnson had arrived at, not through formal strategic analysis, but through the accumulated wisdom of watching what got people caught. What got people caught was evidence. And evidence, in the 1940s, meant paper, ledgers, receipts, contracts, the written documentation that legitimate businesses required and that criminal organizations, attempting to mimic legitimate businesses, often replicated out of habit or organizational necessity. Bumpy's operation ran on memory. Figures were held in the heads of men who had been selected, over years, for two specific qualities: intelligence and discretion. Not educated intelligence. Harlem in 1945 was full of men whose formal education had been deliberately limited by a school system that did not consider their futures worth investing in, but a specific, practical intelligence, the kind that can hold complex numerical information, track patterns across time, and make accurate calculations without writing anything down. The numbers runners, the men who collected bets and delivered winnings across the blocks of Upper Manhattan, carried nothing that could be seized. The amounts existed in their heads until they were settled in person, in cash, in conversations that lasted less than 30 seconds and left no record. The Bureau called this obstruction. It was simply how business was done when the people doing it had learned, through hard experience, that paper was a liability. There was a meeting, February 1946, the exact date unrecorded, that illustrates the fourth layer better than any description. A dispute had arisen between two numbers operations on the edges of Bumpy Johnson's territory. Not a violent dispute, a financial one, a disagreement about the division of revenue from a shared block that had never been formally delineated because formal delineation was not how these things were done. The two men involved were both known to the Bureau. Both had appeared in surveillance reports. Both were considered potential leverage points, men whose disputes might be cultivated into testimony. Fitch's successor on the Harlem assignment, an agent named Morrison who had arrived in 1945 with fresh energy and a revised approach, identified the dispute early. He saw the opportunity clearly: two men with a grievance. A financial conflict that, properly encouraged, might fracture the operation from within. He began working both sides, careful introductions, suggestions that the other party was operating in bad faith, the standard technique. 3 weeks in, the dispute disappeared. Not resolved through violence, no blood, no threats that any informant reported. Simply gone. The two men were observed together at a social club on 117th Street on a Thursday evening. They left together. Nobody who was present reported what was said. Morrison's informant, a man who had been at the club that night, told him the next day. They talked to Bumpy. That was all. No arbitration document. No financial settlement recorded anywhere. No third-party witnesses who would speak on record. Just, they talked to Bumpy, and the dispute was over. Morrison wrote in his field notes that week in the private section, not the official report. The subject functions as a judicial system. Dispute resolution, resource allocation, community enforcement, all of it runs through him. The problem is that a judicial system only becomes visible in its failures. This one doesn't fail often enough for us to document it. He paused, then added, "We are trying to prosecute a man who has made himself necessary. That is a different problem than the ones we were trained for." The Bureau never found the architecture of Bumpy Johnson's operation because they were looking for a building. What was there was not a building. It was weather. It was memory. It was the accumulated weight of a man who had spent 20 years making himself useful to people who had been failed by every institution the country offered them. You cannot subpoena weather. You cannot wiretap memory. You cannot turn a community against a man it has decided not through fear, not through transaction, but through 20 years of evidence it cannot afford to lose. The FBI was one of the most powerful investigative institutions in the world. It had met something it was not built to understand. And for the next decade, it would keep trying. On the second floor above the restaurant on 8th Avenue, Bumpy Johnson watched the street. The boys were still coming home. The city was still loud. The file in Washington was still marked active. He closed the window. Washington, D.C. The Bureau's Organized Crime Division, 1,947. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from a long record of success. It is not arrogance. Exactly. Arrogance is loud. This is quieter. It sits in the way a man holds his shoulders when he walks into a room, the way he reads a file, not searching. Exactly, but confirming. Looking for the familiar shape of a problem he has solved before, in a different city, under a different name. The Bureau's Organized Crime Division in 1947 was full of men who had that confidence. Most of them had earned it. That was the problem. 3 men, over 15 years, came closer to building a prosecutable case against Bumpy Johnson than anyone else in the Bureau's history. Not 3 investigations, 3 men, each one distinct, each one bringing a different approach, a different theory, a different set of blind spots. Each one ending in the same place, transferred, reassigned, or quietly moved to a different division with a commendation that mentioned everything except the specific case they had spent years on. The Bureau did not like to document its failures directly. It preferred the language of transition, reassignment based on organizational needs, transfer reflecting career development, reallocation of resources in response to shifting priorities. What it meant, in each case, was simpler. They couldn't get him. The first man was Raymond Howell, Philadelphia-born. Joined the Bureau in 1938. Assigned to the Harlem operation in 1947 after 2 successful prosecutions in the numbers rackets of Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Howell was 36 when he arrived in New York. He was methodical in a way that impressed his supervisors, not flashy, not given to theories that exceeded his evidence, but patient in the way that good investigators are patient. He built slowly. He documented everything. He had a particular gift for financial forensics, for finding the moment where informal money became formal record, where a cash economy touched a bank, a lease, a tax filing, and left a mark. In Baltimore, that method had produced a conviction in 14 months. He gave himself 18 for Harlem. He spent 3 years. What Howell found in those 3 years was, by the standards of any organized crime investigation, remarkable. He traced cash flows through a network of small businesses, a laundromat, 2 restaurants, a haberdashery on 125th Street, that he believed functioned as financial intermediaries for Johnson's operation. He built a chain of circumstantial connections that, on paper, told a coherent story. The story had one problem. Every link in the chain was circumstantial. The laundromat owner was a 60-year-old woman who had operated the same business for 22 years and whose bookkeeping, when examined by Howell's forensic accountant, was impeccable, irritatingly impeccable. The kind of meticulous that suggested either extraordinary personal discipline or extraordinary preparation for exactly this kind of scrutiny. Howell believed it was the latter. He could not prove it. The restaurants were owned by 2 brothers from South Carolina who had come to Harlem in 1929 and built legitimate businesses that employed, between them, 43 people. Their tax records were clean. Their suppliers were verified. Their customers were real. Howell spent 4 months on the haberdashery alone. The haberdashery was owned by a man named Theodore Garland, who dressed better than anyone Howell had ever interviewed and answered every question with the calm specificity of someone who had been answering questions his entire life and had, long ago, stopped finding them interesting. After the 4th interview, Garland asked Howell, politely, whether there was anything else he needed. Howell said he might have additional questions. Garland said, "Of course, I'll be here." He was there every time Howell came back. He was always helpful, always precise, always exactly as cooperative as a man is required to be when federal agents ask him questions about his business. He never gave Howell anything he could use. The thing about Raymond Howell that distinguished him from Fitch, his predecessor, was that Howell understood, eventually, what he was dealing with. Not fully. Not in time to change his approach. But he arrived at a clarity that Fitch never reached. He wrote it in a personal memo, not an official report, a private document that survived in his personal papers, and was not part of the Bureau's official file in the spring of 1949, 2 years into his assignment. The subject has not constructed a criminal enterprise protected by loyalty. He has constructed a community institution that happens to operate outside the law. The distinction matters because our entire prosecutorial approach assumes the first structure and has no methodology for the second. We are trying to prosecute a mayor. We just haven't admitted that to ourselves yet. He was transferred to the Bureau's Detroit office 6 months later. His file on the Harlem operation was archived under insufficient evidence for prosecution. Case remains active. He never worked organized crime again. He died in 1971. His obituary mentioned his Baltimore and Pittsburgh convictions. It did not mention Harlem. The second man was Daniel Scarpa. Not the Scarpa from the Colombo family, a different man entirely, a point the Bureau's Harlem files note with the weary specificity of people who had been asked about the similarity before. Daniel Scarpa was born in 1,915 inches, Newark, New Jersey, Italian-American, Catholic. He had joined the Bureau in 1940, partly out of patriotism and partly out of the specific ambition of a man who understood that the Bureau offered something his neighborhood did not, a legitimate path upward that did not require the particular moral compromises that the other available paths required. He was assigned to the Harlem operation in 1950 after Howell's transfer. He brought a different theory. Where Howell had focused on financial forensics, following the money, Scarpa believed the case would be built through relationships, through the slow cultivation of someone close enough to Johnson to provide not circumstantial evidence but direct testimony. He was not wrong about the theory. He was wrong about something more fundamental. He assumed that proximity to Bumpy Johnson was a source of vulnerability, that the people closest to him, the men who knew the most, who had seen the most, were the most likely to eventually break. That time and pressure and the right offer would produce, from somewhere in Johnson's inner circle, the witness the Bureau needed. This assumption had worked everywhere else. Scarpa spent 2 years identifying the people he believed were closest to Johnson. He ranked them by perceived vulnerability, financial pressure, legal exposure, family situations that might make federal protection attractive. He built careful approach strategies for each one. He made contact with 4 of them over 18 months. 3 refused to engage at all, not hostilely, not dramatically, simply without the opening that Scarpa needed. Polite, firm, unreachable. The 4th, a man Scarpa had identified as his most promising target, a man with a pending assault charge that federal intervention could have made disappear, listened to Scarpa's entire pitch in a diner on 114th Street on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1952. He listened carefully. He did not interrupt. He drank his coffee. When Scarpa finished, the man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate what you're offering." Pause. "But you're asking me to trade something that lasts for something that ends." He put $3 on the table for the coffee. He left. Scarpa sat in the diner for 20 minutes after he left, looking at the $3. He understood what the man meant. Federal protection ended. Witness relocation ended. The program had boundaries, geographic, financial, temporal. There was a point at which the Bureau's offer concluded, and the man would be left with whatever remained of his life. What Bumpy Johnson offered, not explicitly, not contractually, but through 20 years of demonstrated behavior, did not have a conclusion date. It was simply the world the man lived in. And you do not trade your world for a program. Scarpa filed his report on the failed approach without editorializing. He was a precise man. He did not put his private observations in official documents the way Howell had done in personal memos. His official reports were clean, professional, and revealed nothing of what he was actually thinking. What he was actually thinking in the spring of 1952 was something he expressed only once in a conversation with a colleague who recalled it decades later in an interview with a journalist who was, by then, writing a book that nobody in the Bureau cooperated with officially. He said, "We keep sending men into Harlem who understand criminal organizations. We need to send someone who understands communities. Those are not the same education." Nobody acted on the observation. Scarpa was reassigned to the Bureau's Organized Crime Task Force in New Jersey in late 1952. He had a productive career. Multiple convictions. He retired in 1968 with commendations. He never talked publicly about the Harlem years. The third man was a man named James Whitfield. And James Whitfield is where the story gets complicated, because Whitfield, unlike Fitch and Howell and Scarpa, was not entirely wrong about his approach. He was, in several respects, the closest the Bureau ever came, not just to a case, but to an understanding of what the case actually required. He arrived in Harlem in 1952. He was 33. He had grown up in a black neighborhood in Cincinnati and had joined the Bureau in 1946, one of the very few black agents in the organization at that time, in an institution that was not, to understate significantly, a welcoming environment for the men it occasionally recruited from communities it primarily surveilled. Whitfield understood Harlem in a way that no previous agent on the assignment had understood it. Not because he was black, that is too simple, and Whitfield himself would have rejected the reduction, but because he had grown up in a community with the same architecture, the same informal systems, the same economy of trust and memory and mutual obligation that the Bureau's previous investigators had spent years trying to map from the outside. He didn't need to map it. He already knew the territory. What Whitfield understood from his first week on the assignment was the thing that Howell had come close to articulating and Scarpa had felt but not named. The Bureau was not failing to prosecute Bumpy Johnson because of a lack of evidence. Exactly. Evidence existed, fragments of it, pieces that pointed in the right direction, financial traces that a creative prosecutor might assemble into a narrative. The Bureau was failing because its theory of the case was wrong. It kept building cases that assumed Bumpy Johnson was the center of a criminal organization that Harlem tolerated because it had no choice. What Whitfield saw from the inside, with eyes that recognized what they were looking at, was a man who had made himself the center of something Harlem had chosen. And chosen things are not dismantled by prosecution. They reconstitute. The money would still move. The disputes would still need resolving. The heating oil would still need buying in February. Whoever sat in the position after Bumpy Johnson would inherit the function, even if the Bureau successfully prosecuted the man. Whitfield wrote this in a report, an official one, not a private memo. He submitted it through proper channels in the spring of 1953. He received a response 3 weeks later. The response did not engage with his analysis. It reminded him that the Bureau's mandate was prosecution, not sociological assessment, and that his continued assignment to the Harlem operation was contingent on producing actionable intelligence toward that end. Whitfield read the response twice. He put it in his desk drawer. He continued his work, but something had shifted, because James Whitfield, in the course of his investigation, had done something none of his predecessors had done. He had, carefully and professionally, and with the full intention of using it for the Bureau's purposes, begun to understand Bumpy Johnson not as a subject but as a man. He had read everything available. He had conducted interviews, not just with potential informants, but with people who had no intelligence value whatsoever, people who simply knew Johnson, had lived near him, had been affected by his presence in the neighborhood over decades. What he assembled was not a case file. It was something closer to a portrait. And somewhere in the construction of that portrait, James Whitfield had arrived at a conclusion he could not put in any official document. The man he was building a case against was not what the Bureau said he was. Not innocent, Whitfield was too careful and too honest for that simplification. But not what the file said, something more complicated. Something that the Bureau's vocabulary, its forms, its categories, its legal frameworks had no accurate language for. He was transferred in late 1953. His file was archived. His analysis was not acted on. 1 year later, the Bureau finally put Bumpy Johnson away. Not on racketeering, not on the 20 years of organized crime charges they had spent 2 decades building toward. On a narcotics charge. Whitfield heard about it in his new assignment in Chicago. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already knew. They had never understood what they were dealing with. They had just gotten lucky on a different charge. And luck, as anyone who had spent time on 116th Street could have told them, was not the same thing as understanding. In Washington, the file was updated. Subject incarcerated. Case status. Active suspended. In Harlem, on 116th Street, the numbers still ran. The heating oil still came in February. The disputes were still resolved. The $3 were still on the table in a diner on 114th Street in the memory of a man who had made a choice and never reconsidered it. New York City, Federal Courthouse, Lower Manhattan, 1954. The courtroom was not dramatic. That is the first thing to understand about the day Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to federal prison. There was no gallery packed with Harlem residents, no weeping, no outburst from the defendant, no moment that a filmmaker would linger on. It was a Tuesday morning in January, cold the way Lower Manhattan is cold in January, a wind off the water that finds every gap in your coat and reminds you that the harbor does not care what kind of day you're having. The courtroom smelled of steam, heat, and old wood, and the particular institutional staleness of a building that processes human consequence the way a factory processes raw material. Bumpy Johnson sat at the defense table in a dark suit. He sat the way he always sat, straight, still, with the quality of attention of a man who is fully present in a room without being disturbed by it. The charge was narcotics distribution, not racketeering. Not the numbers operation. Not the organized crime charges. The Bureau had spent 20 years trying to construct into something a grand jury would accept. Not Dutch Schultz. Not the Italian mob. Not the territorial disputes. Not the financial networks that Howell had traced, and Scarpa had circled, and Whitfield had finally understood. Narcotics. A charge that had come together in 8 months faster than anything the Bureau had managed in 2 decades of active surveillance. The Bureau's internal memo, written 3 days after the sentencing and classified for 11 years, described the outcome as follows. Successful prosecution of Subject Johnson on federal narcotics charges represents a significant operational achievement following extended investigative effort. Subject sentenced to 15 years federal custody. Incarceration at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Case status updated to active suspended pending subject's release. The language was careful. Significant operational achievement. Not victory. Not case closed. Active suspended. Even in the language of their own success, the Bureau could not fully commit to the idea that this was over. Because somewhere in the building where that memo was written, someone understood what the memo did not say. They had not won on the case they had built. They had won on a different case entirely. The narcotics charge was real. This requires stating plainly, because the decades of narrative around Bumpy Johnson, the mythology that accumulates around certain men, the way legend and history blur in the retelling sometimes obscures the simple fact. He was guilty of the charge. The Bureau had not manufactured the evidence. The conviction was not a legal fabrication. Bumpy Johnson had moved into the narcotics trade in the early 1950s, a decision that people who knew him well described, years later, as the one choice they had watched him make that seemed to contradict everything else about how he operated. The numbers racket, whatever its legal status, was a community institution. It employed people. It redistributed money within the neighborhood. Its victims, to the extent it had victims, were people who chose to participate in it with the same voluntary engagement that people bring to any other form of gambling. Narcotics was different. The heroin that moved through Harlem in the early 1950s was not a community institution. It was a destroyer of communities. It was taking young men and women who had survived the Depression and the war and the daily diminishment of a country that could not decide whether to include them, and it was taking them apart, slowly, in the particular methodical way that addiction takes people apart. Bumpy Johnson knew this. People who were close to him in those years said he knew it and did it anyway, and that the contradiction lived in him visibly. That he was not at peace with the decision the way he was at peace with most decisions, that there were evenings when the weight of it was something you could see, not guilt. Exactly. Bumpy Johnson did not perform guilt, but the specific heaviness of a man who has chosen to do something he cannot entirely justify. Why he made the choice has been debated ever since. Outside pressure, the Italian syndicates demanding a cut of Harlem's narcotics trade, and the alternative being war, is the explanation most often offered. It is plausible. It is not complete. The complete answer, if there is one, went to Alcatraz with him. The 14th of January 1954, 10:47 a.m. The sentence was delivered. 15 years, federal custody. Bumpy Johnson received it the way he received everything, without visible reaction. He looked at the judge with the same expression he had worn throughout the proceedings, attentive, measured, present, not defiant, not broken. When the gavel came down, he turned to his attorney for a moment. Whatever was said between them was brief. Then he was led from the courtroom. Outside, on the steps of the federal courthouse in the cold January air, a bureau agent who had been present in the gallery, not the primary case agent, a younger man, one of the junior surveillance personnel, watched the courthouse doors close and felt, he would say years later, something unexpected, not satisfaction. Something more complicated than satisfaction. He said, "I thought I'd feel like we'd won something." But he walked out of that courtroom the same way he walked into it. And I kept thinking we've taken him off the street. But we haven't changed anything on the street, and I didn't know what to do with that. He did not include that observation in any official report. The transfer to Alcatraz was processed within 6 weeks. Federal Penitentiary, Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay, the most secure federal prison in the United States. An island, literally surrounded by water. Designed not just for containment but for the specific psychological effect of separation, the knowledge, present every day, that the world you came from is not just inaccessible but invisible. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Alcatraz in February 1954. He was 48 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in Harlem. He had built everything he had within a 10-block radius. He had never, in 30 years of operating in one of the most surveilled neighborhoods in the country, allowed himself to be removed from the center of what he had built. Now he was 2,700 miles away from 116th Street, on an island, in the cold water of the Pacific. What the Bureau expected would happen next follows logically from their theory of how Bumpy Johnson's operation worked. If the operation depended on his personal presence, his arbitration, his authority, his individual relationships, then his removal should produce fragmentation, competition for his position, violence between factions, the collapse of whatever informal order he had maintained. And then the Bureau hoped, and their internal communications suggest they planned for this, the opportunity to move on whatever remained. A fractured operation was a vulnerable operation. People without a patron talk to federal agents. This is what the memo meant by active suspended. Suspended until the fragmentation began. The fragmentation did not begin. 116th Street in the spring of 1954 was not a street that had lost its center. It was a street that had absorbed a blow and redistributed the weight. The numbers still ran. The same routes, the same runners, the same winning number published daily from the same racetrack totals. The dispute resolution still happened different men now. Men who had been trained, through years of proximity to Bumpy Johnson, in the specific methodology of resolving conflict without escalation. The restaurants still bought from the same suppliers. The landlords still received the same quiet reminders about lease terms. The heating oil still came in February. James Whitfield, reassigned to Chicago, but still following the Harlem operation through Bureau communications, read the surveillance reports from 1,954 and 1,955 and felt something he recognized. He had said it in his report, the one the Bureau had responded to by reminding him of his mandate. You cannot prosecute a function. The function continued. Bumpy Johnson was in a cell on an island in the Pacific, reading philosophy, mainly, Spinoza, Plato, the complete works of Shakespeare. The prison library records, which survived in the penitentiary's administrative archive, show a reading pattern of startling breadth: history, economics, poetry, legal texts. He was not marking time. He was thinking about what he had built and what it had cost, about the narcotics decision and what it had meant, about the gap between what he had intended for Harlem and what he had actually delivered. The men who corresponded with him carefully through the prison's monitored mail system, which the Bureau read and found entirely devoid of operational content, described a man who was not diminished by Alcatraz. They described a man who was, in certain ways, clarifying. In Washington, the quarterly reports from the Harlem surveillance team arrived and were filed and were read by people who were looking for the collapse that did not come. By 1956, 2 years into Bumpy Johnson's sentence, the Bureau's internal assessment of the Harlem situation had shifted from cautious optimism to a question nobody wanted to put directly in a memo. If the operation survived without him, what exactly had they accomplished? The question appeared, in various oblique forms, in several communications between the Harlem field office and Bureau headquarters between 1,956 and 1,958, never directly, always through the careful language of institutional communication that has learned to discuss failure without naming it. Harlem operation continues to present significant investigative challenges. Subject's incarceration has not produced the anticipated disruption to identified networks. Recommend continued surveillance and informant development. The recommendations were approved. The surveillance continued. The informants reported. The reports produced nothing prosecutable. The file remained active, suspended. On Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson played chess. He was, by the accounts of other prisoners and prison staff who remembered him, an exceptional player. Patient, strategic, willing to sacrifice pieces early for positional advantages that would not materialize for 20 moves. He did not lose often. The guards, some of whom had worked the island for decades and had developed the specific attentiveness to human character that comes from watching men under prolonged pressure, described him consistently with the same word: calm. Not the manufactured calm of a man performing composure, the real kind, the kind that comes from having decided, at some point before the crisis arrives, how you are going to carry yourself through it. One guard, a man named Patterson, who worked the cell block where Bumpy Johnson was housed for 6 of the 9 years, said in an interview many years later, "In all my years on that island, I never saw a man do his time the way he did. Most men, the island gets to them. The water, the distance, the sound of the city across the bay on clear nights, it gets inside them. He just read his books, played his chess, wrote his letters, did his time like it was a thing he had decided to do, not a thing that was being done to him." Patterson paused in the interview. Then he said, "I always wondered what he was thinking about. 9 years is a long time to think." The Bureau visited twice. Not the Harlem team, Agents from a different division organized crime, national level. Two separate visits in 1957 and 1959, officially logged as routine prisoner interviews. They were not routine. They were, in the careful language of what the Bureau does not put in official documents, attempts to use 9 years of isolation as leverage, to find, in a man separated from everything he had built, the opening that 2 decades of investigation had not produced. Both visits were brief. Both produced nothing. The agent who conducted the 1,959 interview filed a report of 4 sentences. The 4th sentence read, "Subject was cooperative, responsive to questions, and provided no actionable intelligence." Interview concluded at subject's initiative after approximately 12 minutes. At subject's initiative, Bumpy Johnson had ended the interview. Politely, without confrontation, in the way that a man ends a conversation when the conversation has reached the limit of what he intends to offer. 12 minutes. After 20 years of trying, 1,963. February, the gates of Alcatraz opened. 9 years. Bumpy Johnson was 57 years old. He had gone in at 48, in the full momentum of a life built across 30 years of Harlem streets, and he had come out on the other side of a decade of water and philosophy and chess, and the particular solitude of a man who has learned to be alone with his own thoughts without being destroyed by them. He took a commercial flight back to New York. No ceremony, no reception party. He landed at Idlewild Airport on a February morning when the city was cold and gray and smelled of exhaust and the particular wet concrete smell of New York in winter. He took a cab to Harlem. The Bureau had agents at the airport. They had agents on the route. They had agents on 116th Street. He knew this. He looked out the cab window at the city he had been away from for 9 years, and he said nothing that the driver remembered, nothing that any surveillance team recorded, nothing that would appear in any file. He just looked, the way a man looks at something he was not certain he would see again. And when the cab turned onto 116th Street and he saw the block different in the details, the same in the ways that matter, he did something that nobody who was watching him that day had seen Bumpy Johnson do before. For just a moment, before his face settled back into the expression it always wore, he closed his eyes. The Bureau's file was updated that afternoon. Subject returned to Harlem. Surveillance reactivated. Case status active. No longer suspended. Active. Again. Still. Harlem, 116th Street. February 1963. The cab stopped at the corner. He did not get out immediately. He sat for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. The driver would not remember exactly, and looked through the window at the block, at the storefronts, at the barber shop that had changed its sign but kept its hours, at the restaurant that had a new awning in a color that was almost but not exactly the color of the old one, at the corner where the pigeons still gathered in the morning, as if the specific coordinates of that sidewalk had been written into their navigation somewhere deeper than habit. Then he paid the driver, got out, and stood on 116th Street for the first time in 9 years. The temperature was 23 degrees. He was wearing the same dark coat he had arrived in Harlem wearing, the one his attorney had brought to the federal processing facility in San Francisco 3 days before his release. It was 9 years old. It still fit. He stood on the sidewalk, and the block moved around him the way a river moves around a stone, not stopping, not acknowledging the stone directly, but adjusting. The woman with the grocery bags crossed to the other side of the street, not from fear, but from the particular Harlem instinct of giving a man his first moment back without crowding it. The 2 men talking outside the barber shop did not wave. They simply stopped talking, looked, then looked away. In the deliberate way that means, we see you. We are giving you this. The Bureau's surveillance team, positioned at 2 locations on the block, photographed him as he stood there. The photographs show a man standing still on a sidewalk in a dark coat. They show nothing else. because what was happening was not visible from across the street. What was happening was between Bumpy Johnson and 9 years of distance. He was measuring what remained. The first 72 hours back in Harlem were not dramatic in the way the Bureau had prepared for. There was no celebration, no gathering of lieutenants, no visible reassumption of operational control, no meetings that the surveillance team could photograph or conversations that the wiretaps could capture. What there was, instead, was a series of ordinary interactions that were not ordinary at all. He went to Arthur Reeves' store on the first morning. Reeves was 71 now. He had lost weight. The store was the same layout, same smell of sawdust and canned goods, and the faint sweetness of the fruit he kept near the front window. He had, in 9 years, not changed a single thing about the store that Bumpy Johnson would have recognized. When Bumpy walked in at 8:15 a.m. on a Thursday morning, Reeves did not speak for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and put away the price list. Same fold, same motion, same gesture he had been making for 25 years. He said, "The apples are good this week." Bumpy Johnson looked at the apples. He said, "I'll take 6. That was the reunion. 6 apples. A folded price list. 25 years of unspoken agreement contained in a 30-second interaction between 2 old men in a store that smelled of sawdust on a February morning. The surveillance agent outside noted, "Subject entered grocery establishment. Exited after approximately 4 minutes. No significant activity observed." He walked the block every morning for the first week, not with purpose, exactly not going anywhere specific, not meeting anyone specific, just walking. The way a man walks when he is relearning a language he has not spoken in 9 years, getting the feel of the sentences back into his body. He stopped at the corner where the pigeons gathered. He did not have bread. He stood there for a few minutes anyway. He visited the social club on 117th Street on the 3rd day. He was there for 2 hours. The surveillance team photographed 12 men entering and leaving during that time. None of them were the kind of names that appeared in current Bureau files. Some were older men who had been in the neighborhood as long as Bumpy had. Some were younger men who had been teenagers when he went away and were now in their late 20s, part of the generation that had grown up in the Harlem he had built without him present to see it. The wiretap on the social club's phone line recorded 2 calls during those 2 hours. One was about a broken furnace. One was from someone's wife asking when he was coming home for dinner. By the end of the first week, the Bureau's surveillance team had filled 60 pages of logs, 60 pages of ordinary life. An old man relearning his neighborhood, buying apples, drinking coffee, walking slowly, talking to people who had known him for 30 years. Nothing that resembled the resumption of operational control that the Bureau's models predicted. The agent in charge of the surveillance, a man named Dennis Kohler, 38 years old, 10 years in the Bureau, assigned to the Harlem operation 8 months earlier. Specifically, in preparation for Johnson's release, filed his weekly report with a notation he would later describe as the most honest thing he wrote in his entire federal career. Subject's behavior in the first week post-release does not conform to any pattern in our operational models. Recommend extending observation before drawing conclusions about resumed activity. His supervisor approved the extension. What neither of them said in writing, what both of them understood, was that Bumpy Johnson was not being subtle. He was being himself, and himself was something their models had never successfully accounted for. The confrontation, if you could call it, that happened on the 8th day, not with the Bureau, not with the Italian syndicates who had expanded their Harlem presence during his 9 years away, not with the new generation of operators who had filled the spaces his absence had created. It happened with a young man named Marcus, 24 years old, born in Harlem in 1939. He had been 9 when Bumpy Johnson was at the height of his power and 15 when Johnson went to Alcatraz. He had grown up in the Harlem that Bumpy built, without Bumpy in it, and had reached his mid-20s with a particular combination of ambition and incomplete information that is, in any neighborhood, à combustible mixture. Marcus had spent the 9 years of Johnson's absence building something. Not large, he was careful, not reckless, but real. A numbers operation covering 4 blocks on the western edge of what had historically been Johnson's territory. Run cleanly by his standards. No unnecessary violence. Fair returns to the runners. The kind of operation that, in a different context, someone with Johnson's eye for structure would have recognized as well built. He had also, during those 9 years, developed a theory about Bumpy Johnson. The theory was not disrespectful, exactly. It was the theory of a young man who has heard stories about someone his entire life and has decided, in the absence of direct evidence, that the stories are probably exaggerated, that the man is probably human scale, that the particular reverence with which older people speak of him is probably the reverence of nostalgia, which makes everything from the past larger than it actually was. Marcus had won every confrontation he had been in. That was his problem. He didn't know what he hadn't faced yet. They met on the 9th day. Not arranged. Not by design. The kind of meeting that happens in a 10-block neighborhood when 2 people have been moving in the same orbit long enough that intersection becomes inevitable. Tuesday morning, 11:20 a.m., the corner of 116th and 7th Avenue. Bumpy Johnson was walking east. Marcus was coming from the opposite direction with 2 men from his operation. They stopped. The 2 men with Marcus went still in the way that men go still when they understand that the next few minutes are going to be significant and their role in those minutes is to remain exactly where they are. Marcus did not go still. He had prepared for this in the abstract way that you prepare for something you have been told to prepare for without fully believing you will ever need to. He had thought about what he would say, how he would carry himself. How to be respectful without being submissive, a distinction that mattered enormously in the economy of that corner. He nodded. Bumpy Johnson looked at him. Not the way the bureau photographs captured him looking at things, the distant, measured gaze of a man aware of surveillance. This was different. This was the look of a man reading something. The silence lasted longer than Marcus had expected. 3 seconds. 5. 8. The 2 men behind Marcus did not move. On the other side of the street, a woman with a stroller slowed without stopping, the way people slow when the atmosphere changes without knowing exactly why. Marcus held the eye contact. He was not afraid. That was true, and he knew it was true, and he wanted it to be visible. What he did not know, what he could not know, because he was 24 and had won every fight he had been in, was that Bumpy Johnson was not reading his courage. He was reading everything else. The 2 men behind him, the way they stood, the quality of their stillness, whether it was trained or instinctive, the cut of Marcus's coat, the specific corner they were standing on, and what it meant that Marcus had chosen to come this direction on this morning when he must have known, as everyone in Harlem knew, that Johnson was back. He was reading whether this was a confrontation or an introduction, and he was reading something else. He was reading what Marcus had built. Bumpy Johnson spoke first. His voice was the same voice people remembered. Not loud, not performed. The voice of a man who has never needed volume because he has never needed anyone to strain to hear him. He said, "I heard you kept the West blocks clean." Not a question. Marcus said, "I tried to." Bumpy Johnson nodded once. The nod of a man receiving information he had already independently verified. Then he said, "Walk with me." Not an order, not exactly, but not a request either. Something in between the specific register of a man who does not distinguish between the two because the distinction has never been relevant. Marcus walked with him. They walked for 11 minutes. The surveillance team photographed them from a distance. The photographs show 2 men walking east on 116th Street, the older one slightly ahead, the younger one at his left shoulder. No visible tension in either body. No gestures that suggested conflict. What was said during those 11 minutes was not recorded. The surveillance team's microphone equipment was not close enough. Marcus never gave a detailed account of the conversation publicly. Years later, in an interview he gave to a journalist who was writing about the history of Harlem's informal economy, he described it only in general terms. He said, Bumpy Johnson asked him 3 questions. He did not say what the questions were. He said that by the time they had walked 2 blocks, he understood something he had not understood before he started walking. He did not say what it was. What he did say, the one specific thing he allowed to be recorded, was the moment the walk ended. They had stopped at the corner of 116th and Lenox Avenue. 11 minutes. Full circle. Almost. Back toward where they had started. Bumpy Johnson turned to face him. He said, "The blocks you built, keep them. Run them the way you've been running them." Marcus said nothing. Then Bumpy Johnson said quietly, without emphasis, in the tone of a man stating something so obvious that the only reason to say it aloud is to make sure there is no ambiguity. But you build toward something, or you build toward nothing, and nothing doesn't last. He looked at Marcus for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back west on 116th Street. Alone. The way he always walked. Marcus stood at the corner for a moment. His 2 men had caught up. They were behind him, waiting. He didn't say anything to them. He'd just started walking. Days later, weeks later, in the way that the meaning of certain moments arrives on delay, he would understand that what Bumpy Johnson had given him in those 11 minutes was not a warning. It was not a negotiation. It was not a threat, dressed in calm language. It was an education, the most compressed, precise, and consequential education he had ever received. 11 minutes. 4 questions. 1 sentence at the end. You build toward something, or you build toward nothing, and nothing doesn't last. He had walked away from that corner with his operation intact, his dignity intact, and something he had not arrived with. A direction. The federal informant was 22 years old. His name does not appear in any surviving bureau document under his own identity. He is listed only as Source 14 in the Harlem surveillance files from 1963. He had been recruited 8 months earlier, before Johnson's release, and positioned specifically to provide intelligence on the transition period following the return. He was not a bad person. He was a young man who had made a calculation and was living inside it the way young men live inside their calculations, forward-facing, not looking back at the moment of decision. He approached Bumpy Johnson on the 11th day. Not as an informant, Source 14 was careful, trained, aware of the basic protocols. He approached as himself, as a young man from the neighborhood, as someone who had grown up on these streets and wanted, he said, to pay his respect. Bumpy Johnson let him talk. He listened with the full attention he gave everything the quality of presence that people described consistently across decades as the thing that most surprised them about him, that he was actually listening, not waiting to respond, not assessing, listening. Source 14 delivered his prepared approach. Respectful, natural, unforced. He was good at this. He had practiced. Then, because he was 22 and had been trained for 6 months and believed in the preparation, he asked the question his handlers had told him to find an organic moment for. He asked Bumpy Johnson whether, after 9 years away, he was afraid of going back. The block went quiet in a way that blocks go quiet when a frequency changes. Bumpy Johnson looked at Source 14. He looked at him the way he had looked at Marcus, reading. The silence lasted long enough that Source 14 felt it in his chest. Then Bumpy Johnson said 4 words, quietly, without heat, without performance. 4 words that Source 14 would later tell his bureau handlers in a debrief that the surviving file describes as inconclusive subject provided no actionable intelligence. I was never afraid. He said it the way you say something that has been true for so long that saying it aloud feels almost redundant. Not defiance, not bravado, just a fact, the most precise fact he owned. Source 14 filed his last report 3 weeks later. He requested reassignment. He never explained why. The Bureau approved the request without follow-up. On 116th Street, the temperature had risen to 31 degrees. Not warm, but warmer. Bumpy Johnson walked back toward 8th Avenue. The pigeons were on the corner. He stopped. He did not have bread. He stood there anyway. The way a man stands in a place he has decided, without ceremony or announcement, is still his. Harlem. Spring 1963. The surveillance never stopped. That is the first thing to understand about the last 15 years of Bumpy Johnson's life. The Bureau did not reassess after the return, did not conclude, after 9 years of watching Harlem function without him and 11 days of watching him walk his block and buy apples and feed pigeons, that their theory of the case required fundamental revision. They kept watching because the file was active, and active files do not close themselves. The infrastructure of surveillance that greeted Bumpy Johnson's return in February 1963 was, in certain technical respects, more sophisticated than anything the Bureau had deployed in the 1940s. New equipment, better microphones, improved photographic technology, wiretap systems that could capture more, store more, process more than the clunky apparatus Fitch had assembled in 1944 above the dry cleaner on 115th Street. The Bureau had spent 20 years improving its tools. The tools still could not find what they were looking for. Because the tools were better, the theory behind the tools was the same. And the same theory, applied with better equipment, produces the same results with greater efficiency. Dennis Kohler, the agent who had written the honest assessment of Johnson's first week back, continued as the primary case agent through 1,965. He was, by the accounts of colleagues who worked alongside him during those years, a man in a particular kind of professional discomfort. Not loud about it, not insubordinate, but carrying the weight of a man who has been given a task he has privately concluded cannot be completed in the way he has been instructed to complete it. He continued anyway, because that is what you do when the file is active. The Harlem that Bumpy Johnson returned to in 1963 was not the Harlem he had left in 1954. 9 years is not a long time in the life of a city. But 9 years in the early 1960s was not ordinary time. The country was moving, lurching, really, in the specific way that countries lurch when the contradictions they have been managing begin to outrun the mechanisms of management. The civil rights movement had changed the grammar of what Black Americans were permitted to demand. The sit-ins, the freedom rides, the March on Washington, these were not distant events in Harlem. They were present, they were felt, they generated, in the specific geography of 116th Street and Lenox Avenue, and the blocks around them, a particular electricity, a sense that the old arrangements, the ones built on managing the distance between what was promised and what was delivered, were no longer stable. Malcolm X was speaking at the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, not occasionally, regularly, to crowds that grew every month. The message was not the message of patience and incremental progress. It was the message of people who have decided that the incremental approach has had enough time to prove itself. Bumpy Johnson listened. Not as a follower. Bumpy Johnson did not follow, but as a man who understood that the world his operation existed within was changing in ways that required understanding, not resisting. He and Malcolm X were not strangers. They had known each other for years, not as allies exactly, not as opponents, but in the specific way that two men who operate in the same 10-block universe with different methods and overlapping concerns develop a relationship that has no clean category. Malcolm X was changing Harlem's consciousness. Bumpy Johnson was still running Harlem's economy. Both of them understood that these were not unrelated activities. The Bureau watched both of them. Not always for the same reasons. Malcolm X was, by the mid-1960s, one of the most extensively surveilled individuals in America, a separate operation, separate files, separate agents. But the intersection between his world and Bumpy Johnson's world was noted. Documented. Added to the file. What the documentation captured was the surface. Two men who existed in the same neighborhood, who occasionally occupied the same rooms, who had conversations that the Bureau's equipment could not always capture clearly enough to transcribe. What it did not capture was what those conversations meant, because the meaning was not in the words the microphones strained to catch. The meaning was in the fact that these two men, one who had chosen the path of political transformation, one who had chosen the path of community economics, had arrived, from different directions, at the same fundamental position. Harlem was worth protecting, however you defined protection, whatever it cost. February 1965. Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom on 165th Street. February 21st, a Sunday, 3:10 inches the afternoon. Bumpy Johnson was not there. He heard about it, the way most of Harlem heard about it, through the particular velocity of terrible news, which travels faster than any other kind. Within an hour of the shooting, the information was on every block. By evening, the neighborhood had the specific quality of air. After lightning-charged, unsettled, the atmosphere changed in a way that had not yet resolved into anything you could name. The Bureau's surveillance log for the 21st of February 1965 records Bumpy Johnson's movements in precise, clinical detail. Where he was at 3:10 p.m., where he went after he heard the news, who he spoke to, how long each interaction lasted. What it does not record, because surveillance logs do not have a category for it, is the expression on his face when he heard. The people who were with him that day described it years later, in separate conversations, with the same word. Not grief, exactly, though grief was part of it. They said, still. He went very still, the way a man goes still when something confirms a fear he has been carrying for long enough that its arrival feels less like shock and more like the completion of something terrible that was always going to complete itself. He did not speak publicly about Malcolm X's death, not that week, not that month, not in any recorded statement in the years that followed. Those who knew him said he was never entirely the same after. Not broken. Bumpy Johnson did not break, but different in the specific way that a man is different when something that represented a version of hope he had not admitted to himself he was carrying is suddenly, violently gone. The Bureau noted in its surveillance report for the week following the assassination, Subject Johnson has shown no unusual activity, behavior consistent with prior patterns. They were measuring the wrong things. They had always been measuring the wrong things. The last 3 years, 1965 to 1968, have a particular quality in the historical record, not decline. That word implies a direction that is too clean for what actually happened. What happened was more like the specific atmosphere of late afternoon in winter, still fully day, but with a quality of light that tells you the day is counting down. Bumpy Johnson was 60 years old in 1965, then 61, then 62. He had outlasted Dutch Schultz, who died in a Newark hospital in 1935 with a fever and a head full of bullets, dictating feverish nonsense to a police stenographer. He had outlasted the Italian mobsters, who had spent the 1940s trying to absorb his operation. He had outlasted Alcatraz. He had outlasted the Bureau's first 20 years of trying. He had not outlasted the streets themselves. The heroin that had put him in Alcatraz was still in Harlem, more of it now than before. The trade had grown during his 9 years away into something larger and more destructive than what he had participated in. He had made his peace with the narcotics decision, or something that looked like peace from the outside. But the evidence of what that trade did to the neighborhood he had spent his life building was visible every day, on the corners, in the specific human wreckage that accumulates when a powerful and indiscriminate drug moves through a community that has been systematically denied the resources to manage its consequences. He saw it. He did not pretend otherwise. The Bureau's final active surveillance period, 1963 to 1968, produced 847 pages of documentation. This figure appears in the Bureau's own archival summary, prepared after Johnson's death as a formal case closure document, 847 pages. 5 years of active surveillance by a team that had access to the most sophisticated investigative technology the federal government possessed in the mid-1960s. 847 pages. 0 prosecutions. Not 0 convictions, 0 prosecutions. They never built a case that reached a courtroom. Never found the angle, the witness, the document, the financial trace that could survive the scrutiny of a federal trial. The closure document described this outcome in language that had been refined over 20 years of practice into a kind of institutional poetry, the language of failure that does not call itself failure. Investigation produced extensive documentation of subjects' activities and associations. Insufficient evidence developed for prosecution on primary charges. Case closed following subject's natural death. File archived. Organized Crime Division, New York Field Office. Extensive documentation. Insuffisante évidence. Natural death. 25 years of the most powerful investigative institution in the world. And in the end, the file closed not because they won, not because they finally built the case, not because anyone talked. It closed because Bumpy Johnson died first. The 7th of June, 1968, a Friday evening. He was at Wells Restaurant on West 116th Street, a place he had been coming to for 30 years. The smell of the kitchen, the sound of the room, the particular familiar warmth of a place that has absorbed enough of a man's hours to feel like an extension of his own walls. He was playing cards, not for high stakes, not operationally, just cards, the ordinary pleasure of a game among men who have known each other long enough that the game is almost incidental to the sitting together. At some point in the evening, the cards stopped mattering. He died of heart failure at the table. He was 62 years old. The last words he spoke to whom, in what context, have been disputed ever since. Different accounts, different witnesses, different versions of what a man says in the last minutes before he stops saying anything at all. The Bureau had an agent in the area that evening. Standard surveillance. Routine positioning. Nothing that suggested they anticipated anything unusual about the night. The agent's log for the 7th of June 1968 ends mid-entry. The final line reads, "Subject observed at Wells Restaurant, 116th Street. No unusual activity." Then nothing, because by the time the next entry would have been written, there was no longer a subject to observe. The funeral was held at Harlem's United Palace on June 12th. The Bureau attended, not officially, not with credentials displayed. Agents in the crowd, the way agents are in crowds, present without being present, observing without being observed, or believing they were not observed, which in Harlem had never quite been the same thing. The church was full, not with the powerful, exactly though some of the powerful were there. With the neighborhood, the people who had bought numbers, slips, and received heating oil in February, and watched a man feed pigeons on a Wednesday morning for 30 years. The people for whom Bumpy Johnson's name had never needed to be said too loudly because it was woven into the fabric of daily life on those blocks. They came because he was theirs, not in the way that property is owned, in the way that certain people become part of the architecture of a place, inseparable from it. The way you can't describe the block without including the building that has always stood on the corner. The agent who attended the funeral filed a report the following Monday. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the attendance, the speakers, the general order of the service. The second paragraph was 4 sentences. The last sentence read, "No intelligence of operational value was obtained. File formally closed per standard protocol. 23 years of active investigation produced no successful prosecution of subject on primary charges. Recommend archival." 23 years. Recommend archival. Somewhere In a filing cabinet in the New York field office, the photograph was still there. The 40th photograph. The one from September 1943. A man on a corner. A paper bag. 3 pigeons on his arm. One on his shoulder. A Wednesday morning. The beginning of 23 years. It went into the archive with everything else. Active. Closed. Filed. Washington, D.C. The National Archives. 1978. The boxes arrived on a Tuesday. 14 of them. Standard Federal Archive containers, gray cardboard, reinforced corners, the particular institutional beige of documents that have been waiting for someone to ask for them, each one labeled in the precise, effectless typography of a bureaucracy that has learned to store its history without editorializing about it. Johnson, Ellsworth R. Harlem Field Operation Organized Crime Division. New York dates: 1940, 1968 classification, declassified partial redaction. A journalist named Catherine Morse had filed the Freedom of Information Act request 14 months earlier. She was 31 years old. She had been working the organized crime beat for a newspaper that no longer exists, in a city that was still trying to figure out what the 1970s had done to it. She had heard about the Bumpy Johnson file the way journalists hear about things, through a chain of half-conversations, partial references, the specific trail of someone who has been talked about in rooms for decades without ever being fully explained. She spent 3 weeks with the 14 boxes. She read all 847 pages. Then she sat in the reading room of the National Archives on a Thursday afternoon and did something that the archivist on duty remembered because it was unusual. She laughed, not with amusement, with the specific involuntary sound a person makes when the gap between what they expected and what they found is large enough to be almost absurd. What she found in 847 pages was not what she expected to find. She had expected, going in, the documentation of a sophisticated federal pursuit, the architecture of a serious investigation, the kind of file that, even in failure, reveals the scale of what was attempted. The wiretap transcripts full of incriminating half-sentences, the informant reports building toward a theory that never quite solidified, the financial analyses that came agonizingly close. She found some of that. She also found something else. She found the gaps. The gaps were not accidents. In any federal file of this size, covering this duration, there are standard omissions redactions for national security, for informant protection, for the various legal categories that permit the government to keep certain things to itself, even in a declassified document. Those redactions were there. Black bars across paragraphs. Entire pages replaced with single lines. Material redacted section. 7. D. But that was not what she meant by gaps. She meant the spaces between the official entries, the places where the documentation jumped from one date to the next, across intervals that should have contained material but didn't. A surveillance log that ran continuous daily entries for 6 weeks and then skipped 4 days without explanation. An informant report that referenced a previous conversation but contained no documentation of that previous conversation anywhere in the file. An agent's field notes that stopped mid-observation and resumed 3 hours later with no account of what had been observed in between. Not redacted, simply absent, as if someone had decided, at various points across 23 years, that certain things were better left unrecorded. Catherine Morse was careful. She did not conclude, from the gaps, that the Bureau had been corrupt. That is the easy reading, the conspiratorial one, the one that makes a cleaner story. She was too good a journalist for the easy reading. What she concluded, after 3 weeks with the boxes, was more precise and more troubling. She concluded that individual agents, over 23 years, had observed things they did not know how to file. Not illegal things. Not things that implicated the Bureau in wrongdoing, but things that did not fit the forms. Observations that the official categories of federal documentation had no row for. Moments that, if recorded accurately, would have produced reports that looked less like federal surveillance logs and more like something else entirely. Something closer to testimony. Gerald Fitch, the first agent, the one who had arrived in September 1943, certain he needed 8 months retired from the Bureau in 1961. He was 50 years old. He had spent 18 years in federal law enforcement after leaving the Harlem assignment. He had worked organized crime cases in Detroit, in Miami, in Los Angeles. He had built cases that held. He had convictions to his name, commendations, the professional record of a man who had done his job well across a long career. He never talked about Harlem publicly. In 1974, 3 years after his retirement, he was interviewed by a graduate student in criminal justice who was writing a dissertation on the Bureau's organized crime operations in the 1940s. The interview was recorded. The recording survived. The dissertation was never published. The graduate student left the program before completing it for reasons unrelated to the research. The recording sat in a university archive for years. Catherine Morse found it. In the recording, Fitch spoke about the Harlem assignment for 22 minutes, mostly in the careful, professional language of a former federal agent discussing historical operations precise, measured, revealing nothing that could not have appeared in an official report. Then, the graduate student asked him a question. He asked whether Fitch believed, looking back, that the Bureau had ever understood what it was actually dealing with in Harlem. Fitch was quiet for a moment. The recording captures the silence 11 seconds of it, the ambient sound of a room in a house in suburban Maryland in 1974, the faint traffic outside, the particular quality of a pause that is not empty but full. Then Fitch said, "We understood what we were looking for. We never understood what was there." The graduate student asked him to clarify. Fitch said, "We went in looking for a criminal organization. We found something that didn't have a name in our vocabulary, so we kept calling it a criminal organization, because that was the name we had." Another pause. Then, "I think about that photograph sometimes. The pigeons. I took that photograph myself. Did you know that? First month, I thought I'll get close enough to document his daily routine, find the pattern, find the opening, and I got close enough, and I took the photograph. And what I got was a man feeding birds." The graduate student said nothing. Fitch said, "I kept it. In the file. 23 years. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the most honest thing we ever documented about him." The recording ends there. The graduate student had run out of tape. James Whitfield, the third agent, the one who had grown up in Cincinnati, the one whose analysis the Bureau had declined to act on, was still alive in 1978 when Catherine Morse tracked him down. He was 63 years old. He had retired from the Bureau in 1970. He was living in Washington, D.C., 3 miles from the National Archives, where his Harlem reports were sitting in gray cardboard boxes. He agreed to meet her once. Coffee, a diner near his apartment. A Tuesday morning in November, cold the way Washington is cold in November, gray and damp, and carrying the smell of leaves that have been on the ground too long. He was a precise man, still. Careful with his words, in the way that people are careful when they have spent a career understanding that words, once given, cannot be retrieved. He read through her notes from the file, the specific reports she had questions about, the gaps she had identified. He confirmed some of what she had found, clarified others, declined to comment on several. Then she asked him about the report he had filed in 1953, the one in which he had argued that the Bureau's theory of the case was structurally wrong, the one that had produced a response reminding him of his mandate. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I said what I saw. That's all a good investigator can do." She asked whether he thought it had made any difference. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. Then he said, "It made a difference to me. Whether it made a difference to anything else, I genuinely don't know." She asked him the same question she had been building toward since she opened the first box in the archive. She asked, "What did those 23 years actually prove?" Whitfield looked at his coffee. He said, "It proved that you cannot investigate a community from the outside and expect to understand what holds it together. You can document the surface for 23 years, and what you'll have, at the end, is 23 years of surface." He paused. 847 pages of surface. He finished his coffee. He did not add anything. He didn't need to. There is one more gap in the file, the most significant one. The one that Catherine Morse noted in the article she eventually published, a long-form piece in a magazine that also no longer exists, published in 1979, read by a small audience and largely forgotten until it was rediscovered decades later by researchers who recognized what it contained. The gap is on page 412 of the file. It occurs in the middle of a surveillance log from March 1952, the height of the Bureau's most intensive pre-Alcatraz operation. The entry before the gap is a routine notation. Subject observed at social club, no unusual activity. The entry after the gap, dated 3 days later, is equally routine. 3 days missing, no redaction mark, no procedural notation explaining the absence, no reference anywhere in the surrounding material to whatever occurred during those 3 days. 3 days in March 1952 that the Bureau's 23-year file simply does not contain. Catherine Morse made inquiries. Through official channels, through former agents, through the archivist who had processed the original declassification. Nobody could explain the gap. The archivist said it was possible the material had been misfiled. Possible it had been inadvertently destroyed during the declassification process. Possible it had never been created, that those 3 days had simply, for whatever reason, produced no documentation. Possible. None of those explanations satisfied her. She wrote in her article, "The most interesting document in the Bumpy Johnson file is the one that isn't there." 3 days in March 1952, whatever the Bureau saw, or did, or failed to do during those 72 hours, it was decided by someone at some level that it should not be part of the record. In 23 years of meticulous documentation, that is the only whole of its kind. Make of that what you will. Nobody ever filled the gap. The Bureau never commented on it officially. The agents who were active in March 1952 are all dead now. The file remains in the archive, exactly as Catherine Morse found it in 1978. Page 411. 3 missing days. Page 412. The most honest thing in 847 pages is the silence at their center. On 116th Street, nobody talked about the file, not because they were afraid of what it contained, because they already knew what it didn't. Harlem, 116th Street. Now, the block has changed. Not completely. Nothing in Harlem changes completely, because the neighborhood has a memory that outlasts its architecture. Buildings come down, storefronts change hands, the awning colors shift, the names above the doors become different names. But the blocks themselves, the specific geometry of the streets, the way light falls on the corner of 116th and 8th Avenue at 7 in the morning, the sound the wind makes moving between those particular buildings that remains. Some things are written into the ground. Arthur Reeves' store is gone. A different business occupies the space now. The dry cleaner, above which Gerald Fitch rented his first surveillance room, is gone. The social club on 117th Street is gone. Wells Restaurant, where Bumpy Johnson played his last hand of cards on a June evening in 1968, is gone. The pigeons are still there. Different pigeons, obviously, but the same corner, the same coordinates, as if something in the specific geography of that sidewalk still draws them, 50 years after the man with the paper bag stopped coming. The question that remains, the one that survives all the files and all the surveillance logs and all the 847 pages of documented failure, is not the question the Bureau was asking. The Bureau's question was always prosecutorial. Could they build a case? Could they find the evidence? Could they turn the community against the man at its center? Those questions have answers now. No, no, and no. But those are not the interesting questions anymore. The interesting question, the one that the file, in its enormity and its emptiness, forces you to sit with, is this. What does it mean when the most powerful investigative institution in the world spends 23 years trying to dismantle one man in one neighborhood and fails, not almost succeeds, fails completely, documentably, at a cost of millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of hours of federal labor and the careers of at least 3 serious investigators? What does that failure mean? It means at least 2 things that exist in permanent tension with each other. The first is this: Bumpy Johnson was, by any legal measure, a criminal. This requires stating plainly, the same way the narcotics charge required stating plainly in Chapter 6. He ran illegal gambling operations. He was involved in the narcotics trade. He used violence, not as his primary instrument, not as his preference, but as a tool that he was willing to deploy when the situation, by his calculation, required it. Men were hurt. Some men died. The moral accounting of his life does not resolve into simple heroism, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. The Bureau was not wrong to pursue him. It was not a conspiracy of racism, entirely. Though racism shaped the specific texture of the pursuit, the assumptions embedded in the investigation's theory, the particular way federal resources were deployed against Harlem's informal economy, while comparable energies were not always similarly deployed against the formal crimes of more powerful and more protected men. But the pursuit itself, the idea that a federal investigative agency should attempt to prosecute organized criminal activity, that was not wrong. The Bureau had a mandate. It pursued the mandate. The second thing the failure means is harder to hold, because it points not at the Bureau's methods, but at something more fundamental, something about the nature of communities and the limits of institutional power over them. Harlem protected Bumpy Johnson for 23 years. Not unanimously. Nothing in any human community is unanimous. There were people on those blocks who would have preferred a different arrangement. People who had been hurt by his operation or by the trade he participated in. People for whom the mythology of Bumpy Johnson as Harlem's protector felt incomplete or dishonest when measured against the specific costs they had paid. Those people existed, but they were not the weight of the neighborhood. The weight of the neighborhood, the accumulated gravity of 30 years of demonstrated behavior, of February heating oil and folded price lists, and 90-second conversations on stoops that sent landlords home to reconsider their arithmetic. That weight fell consistently across 2 decades and multiple federal attempts. On the side of silence, not the silence of fear. The silence of people who have made a judgment about what they can afford to lose. And that silence, maintained not through any formal organization, not through any system of enforcement, but through the distributed, uncoordinated, individually chosen decisions of thousands of ordinary people, living their ordinary lives, defeated the most sophisticated investigative apparatus the federal government possessed. James Whitfield said it most precisely in that diner in Washington in 1978. You cannot investigate a community from the outside and expect to understand what holds it together. What held Harlem together around Bumpy Johnson was not fear of him. It was something the Bureau had no operational category for. It was the recognition felt rather than articulated, lived rather than stated, that the institutions designed to protect them had not protected them, that the formal economy had excluded them, that the legal system had, with statistical reliability, not worked in their favor, that the government whose investigative arm was renting rooms above their dry cleaners and tapping their phone lines was the same government that had, for generations, managed their lives with a combination of neglect and active hostility. In that context, and it is a context that cannot be removed from the story without making the story false, Bumpy Johnson was not simply a criminal operating in a community. He was, whatever his crimes, whatever the moral complexity of his choices, a man who had made himself useful to people who had been told, repeatedly and structurally, that they were not worth being useful to. You cannot prosecute that. You can document it for 23 years. You cannot prosecute it. The legacy is not clean. This is important to say because clean legacies are for men who did not live complicated lives. And Bumpy Johnson lived a complicated life. The heroin trade he participated in left marks on Harlem that lasted decades. The violence that was part of his world, however restrained, however last resort, left its own marks. The men who were hurt, the families that were fractured, the specific human costs of the economy he operated within those did not disappear because the man at the center of that economy was complicated rather than simply villainous. The legacy carries all of it. The February heating oil and the narcotics charge, the woman who kept her apartment and the men who did not come home, the folded price list and the 9 years on an island in the Pacific, the pigeons on the corner and the 847 pages that proved nothing. What Harlem still says 50 years later, in the conversations that happen in the places that remain, among the people old enough to remember and the people young enough to have inherited the memory without the direct experience, is not simple. It is not, he was a good man. It is not, he was a great man. It is something more specific and more durable than either of those. It is, he was ours, in a neighborhood that had been told, for generations, that it did not own very much, that the buildings belonged to landlords who did not live in them, that the economy belonged to systems that did not include them, that the law belonged to institutions that did not consistently protect them. The fact of ownership mattered. He was ours, not perfect, not without cost, not without the specific moral weight of the choices he made and the harm those choices produced, but present, accountable, reachable, the kind of man you could walk up to on a Tuesday morning on 116th Street and have a conversation with, and the conversation would matter, and the outcome would reflect something about the neighborhood rather than something about systems that operated at a distance from it. That is not nothing. In certain times and certain places, for certain people who have been told they do not matter, that is everything. The Bureau's file is in the National Archives, all 847 pages of it, available to researchers, available to journalists, available to anyone with a FOIA request and the patience to sit in a reading room in Washington and turn pages that smell of 50 years of institutional storage. The 40th photograph is in there somewhere. A man on a corner, a paper bag, 3 pigeons on his arm, 1 on his shoulder. Wednesday morning, September 1943. The beginning of 23 years of failure that produced, in its totality, the most complete portrait the federal government ever assembled of a man it never understood. On 116th Street this morning, the light comes in the same way it always has, east to west, across the same geometry, into the same spaces between the same buildings, some of which are different buildings now but stand in the same places. The corner where the pigeons gather is still the corner where the pigeons gather. The block moves the way it always moved, with the specific energy of a place that has outlasted everything that tried to stop it. Somewhere in the architecture of this neighborhood, in the memory of the people who walk these blocks, in the stories that pass from the people who were there to the people who weren't, in the way certain corners still carry a particular weight that newer residents feel without being able to name Bumpy Johnson, is still present. Not as myth, not as legend, as a man who lived here, who built something here, who, the most powerful investigative institution in the world, spent 23 years trying to take apart and could not, and who died at a card table on a Friday evening in June, on his own block, among his own people, doing something ordinary, the way he had always lived, quietly, in plain sight, daring anyone to explain what law a man breaks by being exactly where he belonged. Some men leave buildings behind. Some men leave silence. Bumpy Johnson left both. And on 116th Street, half a century later, you can still feel where he stood. If you know how to look, subscribe, and we'll show you where to look next.